This whole thing, like all this budget topic would just bloody disappear if all they did was address the housing problem. Like if all they did was we said, you know what? We are so sick of people getting rich off property, whereas people need to live there. And you know what else sucks? A lot of young people, they've been buying investment properties that go up 1% in value and lose the money. And they're screwed because they're going to have to pay tax on what little growth they get. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to revamp the tax system on housing. And we're going to make sure that the people who lose out on housing aren't hurt by it and the people who benefited are not encouraged to do it. And we're going to use that as one of the levers to help restore everything going on in housing. That's the capital gains discussion. I feel like we all wouldn't be talking about it. We all would have just like woken up last Tuesday and been like, that sounds good. Anyway, let's have a conversation about which is your favorite stock this week. But instead, they've just gone and like applied it everywhere. And that's all we're really talking about. We're not complaining about capital gains tax. It's just like, wait. I thought this was about housing. Why are we talking about this other stuff now? The Aussie Fire podcast is a collaboration between Strong Money Australia and Pearler, Australia's favourite boring long-term investing platform. Join our hosts, Dave from Strong Money Australia and Hayden from Pearler, as they discuss all things financial independence. At Aussie Fire, we're big fans of sharing experiences and talking about money. However, please note that any advice is general and does not consider your financial situation, needs, or objectives. Consider whether it's appropriate for you and, if in doubt, speak to a licensed financial advisor.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Aussie Fire podcast. So if you're listening to this episode, you'll know that it's been a while since the budget came out, and hopefully you've listened to our episode on that where we share all of our thoughts and initial observations on the rules that are proposed. And today we're going to do something a bit different. So now that we've fleshed out those previous points, we want to actually discuss more of the nuts and bolts around strategies and different approaches that people might take going forward and some adaptations that we might see in various markets. So we'll give our thoughts on that. And a lot of it honestly is based on some questions that we've received during the week. Because I don't know about you, Hayden, but I've received a lot of questions around this topic. It's certainly made the world of finance a bit more interesting than usual, because once you're in the sort of boring long-term investing strategies, not that much really happens unless you've got like a big market fall or, you know, a nasty recession or something like that. But so this is kind of given us a bit more to talk about, or a bit more novelty or interest than normal.
Yeah, I've had a lot of questions too. It's been feels like to me that when the budget came out, everyone did what was reasonable and kind of reacted intuitively to the changes. And then over the last week, because we're now, by the time you're listening to this, it'll be a week and a half since the budget came out, something like that.
Yeah.
And it feels a lot now that some days have passed that people are starting to do some kind of hard numbers and like proper thinking. You know, it's not just like, oh, am I going to pay more tax? It's a bit more, wait, how much tax am I actually going to pay? Or, you know, how's this actually going to affect this thing? How many more years of work do I actually have to do? So I think that's been the trend that I've seen over the last days.
Yeah, because what's interesting about it is just how different the different scenarios are for varying people and for varying investment strategies in particular. So you built a calculator around this, which will most likely link in the show notes if you haven't seen it, which actually helps you figure out the tax differences with the old capital gains tax system and the new proposed capital gains tax system. So you can go and play around with different numbers to see how it would affect your strategy, if at all.
Yeah, we also did one of our first things recently, which some of you may or may not have seen. I think we had about 40 people there. We did an Instagram live pretty much a week after the budget was announced. It's already out on our YouTube channel. You can check that out. You can follow links in the description, or you can just search up Aussie Fire Podcast in YouTube. But yeah, if you want to kind of see some of the lighter Q&A we've done, that'd be worth checking out. But for the purposes of this episode, we're going to not rehash, much of what was covered there because it's already been covered, and we're going to get into some other things, as Dave said. So feel free to check that out if you kind of want the full experience of every ounce of Q&A.
So I wanted to start this discussion off, mate, with something that I'd seen mentioned on socials or in various places, and that is the suggestion that the strategies or the tax incentives that are being adjusted or reduced or whatever, that's being done because people basically abuse the system, or they're like loopholes that are being closed. Do you see it that way, or do you think that that's a bit of a rough take?
I don't have a comment on whether loopholes should be closed or if a loophole's bad. It would depend on the specifics, but the budget definitely seems like they were trying to be so heavy-handed and wide-reaching that there wasn't an obvious place to go, and you can see that in the commentary post-budget, as it feels like no one's sitting there being like, well, now the new strategy is X. And it's like so obvious, like property's dead. There's been a few like commercial real estate, PPOR, super, but nothing that's kind of like a slam dunk. So that's the impression I got. Yeah.
But I think the idea loophole is the wrong phraseology to use, right? Because it's not like some mysterious rule that no one knows about. These are like the tax system doesn't happen by accident. It's designed in a certain way on purpose to encourage and incentivize different things. So it's not like some obscure thing hidden in some subsection clause 7A of like page 27,000 of the tax code.
Yeah, like I agree. And I just think that I do feel that this budget is somewhat ideological, is how I've been describing it. It feels like they've been doing policy based on kind of a principle, which is I think also why when they get follow-up questions, they don't have good answers sometimes, because it seems like it's more like that there's like a broader principle that's informing it more than like all of this deep economic modeling. Like I've never seen them be like, well, and I might just not have seen it to be fair, but by adding the 30% floor on this, we're going to cause, 1 million people who were previously doing X to not do that. The answers often seem just more like, well, we think it's really important that the tax system's more fair and that workers, are encouraged to, do more and people are discouraged from building capital. And I'm like, yeah, okay. Like that seems ideological. At least, it's still only been 9 days since the budget for us as we're recording this. So my view on that might evolve.
Yeah, they definitely don't seem to have great answers when people bring up questions like, what about situation XYZ or, group A that's involved over here that's going to be detrimentally affected that for sure is not part of the goal, right? And the answer to that or how they approach that with an answer is generally the vibe comes off as, well, it is what it is. This is what we think we need to do.
On the ideological part, I do think it does seem very like that. They seem to talk about fairness a lot, and in their defense as well, I was doing these numbers last night in a spreadsheet, and I was looking at the apartment that I own, and I was like, if this apartment grows at 4% per annum and inflation stays at about 4% per annum, I'm not going to pay any tax on this post 2027. And again, I was like, no one really talks about that. There has been some comments around, this being a tax grab, and I understand where that comes from. There's definitely some elements that feel like a tax grab, but some parts of it too just feel like they started with like, how do we make it fairer so that, the downside cases are less downside, the upside cases are less upside, that, society distributes the wealth more. Whether or not that's the right thing to do, that does seem to still just, be where it's coming from.
I see a lot of discussion around this when it comes to talking about tax rates and amounts of tax that are paid by people with assets, people with wealth and all the rest of it. And there seems to be this assumption that these tax incentives are bad for society because they help people either with businesses that end up with high levels of wealth or people that are investing that are eventually going to become self-sufficient, or that's the idea behind the investments in the first place. But the strange part for me is that when you look at who pays tax, and who pays the most tax and what the tax base is funded from, it ends up being from a fairly small percentage of the population is paying a fairly large or outsized amount of tax. And when you look at it across society, you basically have, over people's lifetimes, you have like 60% of the population, it turns out, ends up being net takers from the tax system. Like they don't pay enough in tax over the course of their lives. That amount is less than what they receive in benefits over the course of their life, whether it's through the health system or, decades worth of pensions or family benefits or all the rest of it. Whereas the people who end up being wealthy or rich that supposedly pay very little tax, they're the ones that end up being overwhelmingly net payers into the tax system. So it's already heavily reliant on those people to begin with. So the idea that they're somehow like skirting tax and the burden is falling on like poor people or average people, it sounds right in theory, and Australia is heavily reliant on income tax to, I think it's more than 50% or something like that, to actually fund everyday operations or whatever, part of government revenue. But when you look at it holistically across people's lifetimes, it doesn't work like that at all. It's basically being propped up by people who are paying substantial amounts of tax over their lifetimes, which tends to be people with more money, people with wealth, people with assets.
Yeah. One of my great revelations of the last, I guess, few years has been realizing how difficult it is to trace the tax benefit through the system as well. A palatable example people might think of might be negative gearing. Okay. You negatively gear a property, landlords can charge less rent, right? That has the perverse effect of like they can either charge less rent or they can buy or sell the house for more, which is the the side of that coin we don't like. But one of the examples that got me recently, Dave, was thinking about, when I was younger, I used to buy a lot of secondhand phones. I mean, like for pretty much my whole life, buy them off eBay, like 1 or 2 years old. And it was this year or last year, maybe it was Christmas, I can't remember, but it was the first time that I bought like a new phone, I think. It wasn't refurbed or something from like a store, just had a deal or something. And I bought this phone for like, it was like a $1,400 phone. It was a nice phone. I started doing a lot more filming with my phone. But because I bought it for work, like I bought it to do filming for work, it's a work expense phone. So it's like, okay, that's tax deductible. Then it's like, all right, well, let's say that's 37% off. It's like, all right, well, I bought that phone for $1,400. It probably only actually cost me like $900 after the tax return's done. And then, I think about, I'll probably hold on to the phone for a year or two. And then because I bought it for $900, I'm happy to sell this thing for probably, I'll sell it for what I can, of course. But like, just in terms of emotionally, I'd be like, yeah, I'll sell it for $400 in a couple of years or something like that. And I just like wouldn't sell it for that cheap. If I, just to be clear, let's imagine I could sell the phone for $900, but someone was like, oh, I'll buy it off you for $600. I'd be like, yeah, sure, whatever. Because like in my head, it only cost me $900. But if I paid $1,400 for it, I would be so much more touchy about the amount of money I'd lose. And then you think about it, and it's like, well, you could look at it as in, a medium to high income earner basically got, $400 back from the taxpayers on the phone because it was a work thing. But then you also take that down and you're like, well, what about the person you sold it to? And then I think back to all those years that I was buying secondhand phones, and you're like, where do these phones come from? Do they come from places where it's like certain tax incentives in the government allow these things to be cheaper through the system? And that might be a terrible analogy. And there's probably some smart people out there listening that are like, that is a terrible analogy. But the point still stands. I think we can get very like one-dimensional with taxes and forget about how it flows through the system. And that's where it can get really tricky, being like, oh yeah, rich people have, don't pay as much tax or something. It's like, well, I don't know how to trace it. We were talking last time about with properties, how, if you can negatively gear a new build or something, that makes it cheaper to eventually pass on to the next person, So like, where is that benefit felt? And I don't know is the answer. I'm not trying to make a point. It's more just like this stuff is complicated to figure out and attribute.
It's tricky because if you imagine someone who's, well, first of all, like a lower percentage rate of tax overall is very, very different from paying less tax than someone else, right? Because it could be a lower percentage rate of tax on a much bigger number of dollars. So I think that's something that people get or people conflate all the time. And then the other thing is if someone's getting a tax incentive or a tax benefit, usually it's been structured that way for good reason. Like most countries offer tax incentives for businesses, tax incentives for investors for good reason. And then if you think about it in terms of like a middle income person who's saving, investing for retirement, we're basically saying, we understand that it's better to have you not reliant on the government. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you a tax benefit so that you can save and invest for your retirement to ideally become self-funded. So super will attract a lower rate of tax than investing outside your super. So that actually makes sense. But then if we say that person wants to save and invest outside super, then all of a sudden they're like some rich grifter who wants a handout, right? We have this like contradiction between how we want to tax things and the labels and the assumptions that are made with those two groups of people. So it's a bit funny when you think about it like that. And the other thing is, even though it seems like tax incentives benefit certain groups of people that may not need it, if middle income people are able to get like a tax incentive outside super or whatever, inside super, it's going to eventually lead to, like if they get $100,000 in tax benefits, or tax incentives, tax savings, whatever, it might save like 500 grand worth of pension in the future or $1 million worth of pension. Because I looked this up. It was like the average retiree that is fully reliant on the government ends up costing between $500,000 and $1.1 million or something, depending on the situation. But like, it's a substantial cost. So if you can get a certain segment of the population, as many as possible, to the point where they're not reliant on the government, that ends up saving way more than it cost earlier on in their life in terms of tax benefits that they might get. Does that make sense? Have you looked at that or anything?
I agree. I always think if you look at politics and you break up issues in politics into social issues and economic issues, right? I love talking about economic issues because social issues are very difficult to discuss because you can't really assure that you come to a conclusion. You know, if I'm talking to someone who's like anti-abortion and I'm okay with abortions, then it's like you can get into the minutiae of, timings and all this stuff, but it's like you're often just fighting people on their culture and values a lot of the time. Like there's no easy way to win it. But what I love about economic topics is that everyone kind of wants the same thing. Like if you unpack it, like if you just go talk to 90% of Australians, whether they're like quite, economically progressive or economically conservative, and you like ask them what they want, or you say, hey, do you like the idea of a system that promotes a significant amount of growth in our economy whilst also making sure we look after the people who need the money, the people who are unemployed, the people who are sick, the people who are unwell? Like most people just say, yeah, of course. And you realize you're actually debating on execution. And the cool thing about execution is that it's somewhat scientific, very complicated. Like I couldn't answer a lot of it, but there are those funny things where it's like, okay, you think about a luxury car tax. People pay tax on a car that's over like, I don't know, 100 grand or something like that, extra tax. And it's like, well, obviously you think we want to, 1% tax is good. 1% tax on car value over 100 grand, because like that's not going to stop anyone buying a car and we'll get some money. But then if you charge 99% tax, then no one buys the car anymore. And then you end up having no tax money for the car. And it's like most people would agree on that. And then you realize, well, we actually kind of agree that we like need to tax stuff so that people either don't do it or we make revenue, particularly for the people who can afford it, but we don't want to tax it too much. And then you're just like, well, it just is then going to depend on what works, like somewhere in there is the sweet spot, and that sweet spot probably changes all the time. And I think that's a healthy way to approach these kinds of conversations when you get into disagreements with people, is just being like, we all kind of agree, we just need to like actually do the numbers. And often people like me don't have the expertise to go and figure out what the right answer is. We've got to rely on Treasury for that half the time and hope the politicians don't cook it up. I still always think about, I wonder what Treasury proposed. I really would. I would pay money to see that. I'd pay money to see like Treasury was like, you shouldn't do this or you should do this. And the government was like, yeah, we need to get reelected. So don't worry about that one. I'd love to see the raw stuff that they come up with. Yeah.
It's very interesting because even though you said everyone will agree on the basics, I'm on board with that. But where everyone will disagree is on the details. Like everyone's going to exist on this spectrum of what's fair to spend money on, what's a fair level of tax, what's a fair size of government, where the money should go the most, like all these different proportions. That's the part that everyone will disagree on. That I think that's just going to be like a permanent state of affairs. So I think where you have people disagreeing, it's like we all agree on the basics, but it's just the details, and everyone sits at a different point along the spectrum of all of these different things.
But I think it's because we have different understandings of the necessity of it too, or like what's actually going on. It's like if you could go and like if let's say you're a really progressive person and then you're with a really conservative person. If both of you went and spent half an hour with every single NDIS person who's on the NDIS and saw all their details, which would take, like 15 years to be clear, it's not possible. But if you went and did that and you got to see every single one, I think most people would agree, or at least get like way closer. And I think that's the depressing part about all these types of debates is like, we're all fighting about contexts we don't have, like we don't know. Like people say, oh, screw the boomers. Like who are the boomers? Like these people don't even know who they're talking about. You haven't met most of them. You haven't met most of these young people who are slaving away. Like I bet if a bunch of young people went and sat around with a bunch of old people, they'd be like, it just feels really mean to try and take money off them. And I bet if a bunch of old people went and saw how much these young people are struggling in the depths that they are, they'd be like, oh shit, I better give them some of my money. And like that's what gets me is I agree with you that people don't agree, But I think a lot of that's just because it's not possible for everyone to see the same world, which is kind of the crappy endpoint of it a little bit.
This is why I don't like even people having like labels and groups like this generation, because it's just endless, like an endless media circus of people just getting outraged, which is, it's only really happened in the last like 10 years, would you say? Before that, people didn't think in terms of this generation versus that generation.
I mean, there's been a big cultural push towards grouping people for sure across a whole bunch of things, whether it's, generation or other kinds of identities, definitely, which has been helpful because that's just people trying to make sense of the world. Like, I'm trying to make sense of the workplace, and I work with people who are 20 years old and people who are 40 years old, and I'll refer to them generationally just to try and make sense of them because I'm confused why they're different sometimes, But yeah, you can obviously take it too far and start to stereotype people if you're not careful with it, for sure, which is a problem.
It's just in public discourse, it's just very rarely done in a productive way. It's very, very commonly done in either a self-victimhood way or like to demonize another group or to say all sorts of things like that. But let's bring it back to our world rather than the world at large, mate. And I want to talk about whether any of these changes, well, first of all, will they affect your strategy, and will you be planning to pivot in any way towards a different approach or different assets or anything like that?
Yeah, there's two fronts to this. I'll give you a really quick answer because we've been rambling a bit. In terms of equities, I don't change my equity strategy. Obviously, the benefit that my previous global or US portfolio had compared to the Australian portfolio, that gap is reduced in my mind. So it's like because of the CGT changes, there's going to be more tax paid on a US-based portfolio than an Australian-based portfolio. But I do think that that's somewhat going to be mitigated if the current budget proposals go through. It will discourage certain types of growth in our economy by a small portion. Like, I'm not a doomer with it, you know what I mean? Like, some people are like, this will be the end of business investment in Australia. It's like, no, I just think, like all things, if they tax it more, people are going to do less business stuff. And I think, like, call it 10% less business stuff will be fine. Most people won't notice it. But so I'm like, okay, well, they're going to tax my US portfolio more and they'll probably cause my ASX portfolio to stifle by 10%. I don't know if that's going to happen, but it's more just like on principle, I'm like, seems like it's just, I'll just leave it alone. So on the equities front, I don't intend to change anything at this point in time. We'll kind of see how it goes. We'll see if I'm the laughing stock if the entire US economy collapses. And on the housing front, I think the previous plan was to try and buy a like quote unquote dream home and pay it off over a number of years as an investment property, because the mortgage repayments as a primary place of residence would be just absurd, not doable. And now it's more like, well, probably that just has to get held off and be like, just kind of wait till I have the money to have most of the loan or like a large chunk of the loan dealt with. So they're the two main changes based on just the proposals. What about you? Yeah,
the changes don't really affect my strategy in any way. So for a long time, I've had a more Aussie heavy portfolio than global. That's kind of balancing out a bit now. I think it's like 60-40 as we record this, 60 Aussie, 40 global. But we're able to just live off the dividends. We don't really need to sell anything. So I'm not really going to incur any extra capital gains tax from selling off any global portions of the portfolio. So that part's fine. On the property side, and I won't change anything either. I'll still keep investing basically half going forward as was the plan. So that'll stay the same. On the property side, we've still got one property to sell, which we're planning to sell either late this year or next year sometime. So that's still the case. We'll probably still sell if the market's, reasonably okay. And I won't really be impacted by the capital gains tax changes for that too. And even if I was to delay it another year, it's only going to be like a few months or something into the proposed changes. So it's going to make basically no difference. So yeah, no change there either.
Good for you, Boomer. That's what the budget was designed for, right?
To protect me. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, to protect all the boomers over 70 like Dave. No, that's good. I mean, that's, I guess, a helpful side effect of, your FIRE strategy being income-based at the end of the day, right? Like, that's a huge part of it, as opposed to if you were starting to sell stuff down.
Yeah, I think some people have overestimated the impact potentially because they're forgetting that the even the global side of their portfolio will still have income. So you're still going to be in a situation where even if you had like a global heavy portfolio, you're probably still going to get 2 to 3% a year in income distribution. So you won't actually have to sell that much. And so the tax or extra tax on that won't be that much. But there is situations, especially where you're planning to do like a two-phase strategy, where you're selling off potentially large portions of your outside super portfolio to get you to the point where you can then happily live off your super portfolio at age 60. So like if you're retiring at say age 45 and you've got this, personal portfolio bucket and you're like pulling out 80 grand a year or something from that to get you to age 60, that's going to be like a substantial amount of extra tax, like 5 to 8 grand a year or something like that. I can't remember what was the numbers that you found from playing around with these scenarios, but it was basically if you're pulling out a lot, it's going to make a big difference. So the two-phase strategy is hurt quite a bit by this.
Yeah, that sounds about right. The explanations I've been telling people are like, if your growth matches inflation, you pay no tax. If your growth doubles inflation, you pay the same tax as you used to. And once your growth triples inflation, you pay 50% more tax than you used to. And to be clear, that's not 50% tax on your gain or something like that. It's just 50% more tax. So if you used to hand the government $100, at 3 times inflation, you are going to hand them 150. That's like the quick math of it all. And that double inflation thing's worth thinking about, because it is important to remember in a high inflation environment, a lot of people could end up better with these changes. And in a low inflation environment like we had before COVID, you could end up a lot worse.
Yeah, it's going to depend entirely on your strategy and how growth heavy that strategy is. So most people have probably listening to this, they've probably done some reading around on forums and Facebook pages and that, potentially talking to people who might be, looking for alternative strategies. And some of the ones I've seen floated are obviously like a transition to more a dividend heavy portfolio, a bit more Aussie shares in there, maybe living off rental income instead, maybe some commercial property as an alternative, or like a peer-to-peer lending. Anything that's more income-based than selling assets is going to be more efficient if the new rules come in. So yeah, that's something to think about. I don't know if you've seen this, but I've noticed a few people are like, or you could just leave Australia entirely. Like people are having like somewhat dramatic reactions to it. And well, I suppose we could talk about that in a future episode, like the idea of living somewhere else.
Yeah. I think a lot of that stuff's dramatic. Yeah, I mean, all the 40-year-olds out there with their kids in school who are going to pick up and leave so they can pay less marginal tax when they sell out a business they start in 7 years. Like, it's much more forward-looking. Like, it's much more less about I'm going to leave Australia for most people. It's more about what does it signal to an 18-year-old who's about to start their career and has nothing to lose. That's kind of where the interest area is. But one thing, Dave, is like, do you think there'd ever be an ETF that could exist where like they would track inflation and they would try and balance income and growth stocks accordingly? Is that even technically possible in terms of they're like, wow, we have high inflation, we might as well go harder on growth? Because I guess there's an element here which is like, in a sense, if inflation's really high, like we sometimes talk about this as like, growth stuff is now bad, but it's more just like growth stuff that outpaces inflation significantly is now bad. But growth stuff that sticks with inflation is like very tax advantageous. You pay no tax on it. Like if inflation's 4%, right, Dave, and you earn income, like 4% income, you still pay tax on that income, right? Obviously. But if
potentially.
Yeah, but if you have a capital gain of 4% in a 4% inflation environment, you pay no tax. So it's like, that's the other side I feel like is missing here is it's less about that it's worse and it's more about that it just swings from like good to bad. Like high inflation, growth way better than income. Low inflation, growth way worse than income. Anyway, my question was, do you think there's ever a way to kind of like have something that tries to track inflation and then does investing according to that, like within a type of fund or LIC structure to like maximize, income in low inflation environments and then capital gains in high inflation environments? I'm
sure it's possible if you're tracking inputs and you can adjust things. You want me to be a Perla portfolio manager? I'm sure it's possible, but the issue with that is then once it becomes a known thing or a strategy, then it starts to have its own, people start to front run it and stuff, right? People start to, it becomes its own self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if you're going to start pivoting at certain times when inflation's at, then as soon as that happens, then other people will do it. And then people are going to be like copying each other. And then the prices of those assets are going to go up. So it's going to like increase the effectiveness of it in the short term. But then obviously the people who get in late, whatever, then they're going to have worse returns, because it's just going to, people are going to like try and capture this pricing difference. It's going to become like a game. But I don't think it would happen to a massive degree. It would be, you mean an ETF that's more targeted at people who are about to live off their assets, right? Or do you mean one that's trying to outperform?
I don't know about an ETF, but I mean, if you thought about it like you started your own company that, you know, you could control whether you just pay profits or whether you just acquire more businesses and try and increase the value of your company. That'd be really interesting to think about someone optimizing that based on inflation to some degree. Because you really do kind of want to, you do still want capital gains up till a point. Like that is still more tax ed. I mean, just to be clear, like I have an apartment in Sydney. Let's just say it grows at 3%. I don't know what the average growth rate is. It didn't even occur to me till I did the numbers last night, which is so silly of me. But I was like, you know, if inflation stays at 4% or whatever, and this apartment grows like from, you know, 700K to like 1.1 million over 10 years or whatever it is, I'll have a capital loss to declare, I think, Dave, if I'm understanding the tax code properly. Because like if inflation's at 4%, like I mentioned, I bought it today for that amount or whatever it is. Yeah, if I sell it for less than the inflation adjusted cost base, I think that's a capital loss. And I was just like, that's so weird. It's like a new way of thinking that I hadn't thought about, is like, I might be able to make money off the apartment one day and then claim it as a tax loss, which is just like not how I've thought my entire adult life. The adult life was like, well, if you sell it for more than you get it for, it's a gain. Full stop.
Yeah. There's plenty of scenarios where in a lower growth asset, you're better off under the tax system. But obviously then people are going to be like, but you made less money, which is potentially true, right? Because you'd rather have growth than not have growth. So it's going to depend on the asset mix you want, because obviously higher growth assets are going to have less income and vice versa. But yeah, you would need to have a capital gain to kind of get the benefit of that tax loss somewhere else.
It's like, it's just weird to think someone has an apartment that earns them no income, but it grows at 3%. And then someone has an apartment that pays them 3% income and grows not at all. And it's like these new rules designed to, you know, punishing capital gains. You'd for sure take the one that is growing, not the one that's paying income at those like lower rates. And I don't know, I just think that's something I've just not hearing people talk about. Like everyone's talking about everything as if they're making 10% returns or 10% income on tons of stuff. And if the numbers just aren't that much bigger than inflation, it's the opposite. And a lot of people's portfolios don't grow that much more than inflation sometimes in high inflation environments.
Yeah. One of the questions that I've seen a few times is people wondering whether it is still a smart strategy to build up a share portfolio and then sell later to buy their home. What do you think about that? Because that's kind of, those calculations have changed a little bit.
I kind of hate this question because it's such like a what if type of question, you know? Like a good example is for a lot of share portfolios, say you're like IBV type portfolios, I think the rough numbers I did were like you're going to lose 10 to 15% of the growth. So if before you were going to walk away with a gross value before tax of 10%, instead of coming away with 7.5, you're going to come away with like 6 to 6.5 now. And it's like, that's a real chunk of change, but like, it's just a difficult thing to think about, because what if these tax changes do legitimately cause house price growth to slow down in their increase too, proportionally as well to that same degree? So it's like, in that case, it's like, well, then the strategy is fine, because as it stands right now, the government's really just kind of been punishing to capital growth in general, which will just kind of slow the effectiveness of capital growth in general. So I think it's still a perfectly fine strategy for sure. That's what I'm doing. I think that's been my kind of understanding of this budget, is it just doesn't really change a lot, except for those trying to build wealth makes it slower. Like that's kind of it. Yeah. Really. So yeah, I wouldn't change my strategy. I don't know if you were doing all of this again and you were younger, Dave, than you already are, would you change your strategy in terms of, I know you did it with investment properties, but yeah, does it swing you in a different direction?
if I was looking to buy a home as soon as possible, I'd probably just save in cash because it wouldn't take very long for me to save a deposit. So it wouldn't make sense for me to invest if I'm going to buy a house within 2 or 3 years. So I probably wouldn't bother, and then I'd buy the house, and then I'd probably just start compounding investments as much as I could. So yeah, I probably wouldn't. It wouldn't change anything for me. If it was going to be a longer time frame, it does kind of hurt that a bit, and it makes it a bit trickier because you're basically taking the same amount of risk with a lower expected net return after tax. So it does change the trade-offs a little bit. It's not enormous, but it would make me think twice, I guess.
Yeah, it's tricky. I know people have said things like this encourages you to put money into your PPOR as well. I get that idea.
Everything does, eh?
Yeah.
Every part of society angles you in that direction.
Like, it makes sense to, like, you can think of it simply. It's like, okay, well, your primary place of residence, you don't pay tax on when you sell it. That's the same. Super rules are the same. But everything else kind of gets marginally worse. So that makes the other, the primary place of residence marginally more appealing. And I get that thinking, but I think before people be like, I need to put all my money into my house, it's also just, that's a lot of money you might not be able to access for a long time. And I feel like that part's kind of missing. I always get kind of worried when I see these 25, 30-year-olds leveraging themselves up on their really expensive homes. And I just think, like, what's your aim? Are you just super excited about like your nice dinners when you're 50, to some extent? Like, it's not that you can't get money out because you can obviously, refinance and redraw funds and all kinds of stuff, but that's probably the best 20-year strategy. The real question is like, are you genuinely trying to optimize for that 20-year strategy, or like, do you need some kind of shorter term optionality or flexibility in your plans? But yeah, for sure, the PPOR thing is more relevant. There's no other real advantages to a primary place of residency, Dave, except the fact that you don't pay tax on
status, mate. Status. You're missing the whole point. Social status. Get a bigger house than everyone else. It's better.
I have to say, the one thing I have been thinking about with this negative gearing change is it really never occurred to me because it's so like unintuitive to me that I just never genuinely considered it. This idea that you can be a young person, you can go buy a home that's yours, that's your primary place of residency. Then you can say, okay, I live in it now. Move out of it into a rental, rent it out, make income from rent, make a loss on the bloody, interest payments, claim that as a tax deduction against your personal income. Meanwhile, you're living in a shoebox somewhere else or back at home with your parents. And then when you sell the damn thing, the government's like, well, you lived there anyway. So, I guess you pay no tax on the way out. And I'm like, why is that not in the news? Why were they not talking about that? Like, that's an obvious, this is what I mean. I don't understand this budget sometimes because that's like, I don't know how many people do that.
Would you say it's a loophole?
I'd say the 6-year thing's a loophole. You should be able to move out of your primary place of residency for what, like 12 months? I don't know. I haven't thought about it, but like, I don't understand the 6-year thing. It's like, and if you do want to make it your primary place of residence, that's fine, but you can't claim negative gearing. Like, if you make a loss, that's the end of it. Or I don't know, just all this stuff. I'm rambling, but I don't feel sometimes like some of the stuff that really matters is being talked about. And instead it's like, yeah, we're going to tax IVV investments more. It's just like, okay.
It is somewhat inconsistent, but I guess if you always work under the premise that the principal place of residence will always be favored over everything else, you can, I guess, operate accordingly. Like, that will be the absolute last thing that will be touched. There's a whole ton of other things that they could tinker with, and potentially they will over the next 5 or 10 years, but it's a pretty safe bet that people's homes are going to be the last thing that they go for. But the bit with the whole PPOR, maxing that out, the part that annoys me about that is it just creates this, it's like the ultimate, and super as well, in conjunction with super, it's like the ultimate equity rich, cash flow poor situation that Aussies already lean towards anyway, right? We're already like house heavy relative to basically every other nation where we stuff our money. And then we're stuffing the rest of our money in our super that we can't access for 30 years because these things are tax efficient, but they're not like life efficient, right? They're very anti-freedom in a way. So that's the part that they are. That's the part that annoys me.
I've never thought about that. Yeah.
I just made it up. I don't know. They're just, it just annoys me. Like, I just don't like that idea of having so little flexibility. I mean, yes, you can downsize, and if you've got a 10-year goal in mind, 15-year goal in mind, you're like, okay, I am going to max it out and I'm 100% not going to stay here. I'm going to sell and downsize later, then sure, that can make sense. But I don't think a lot of people want to downsize after they've lived in a nice big home.
I agree. I hate the idea. They often talk about these things like unproductive assets, and I feel like I've become more of a convert with this after just starting my own business and working in businesses for a while now. If you took these $500,000 or $600,000 deposits that people are putting in their primary place of residence that does nothing at all. They don't even pay CGT on the way out. If you just encourage people to put that into local businesses or start businesses, that employ people, even if you made them say, if you start a business, we're not going to charge you any, capital gains tax. We're going to charge you 10% capital gains tax if you sell the business one day. It's like, it's not even really a tax dodge because anyone in business has to pay all kinds of random taxes. They got to pay payroll tax, anyone they employ, it's funny. I think about this a lot. It's like the business pays the income tax. Like if there's no business around to pay the employee, there's no income tax to pay the government. Like it doesn't exist. The business pays it. And it's like, you can't just, if a business employing 20 people goes bust, those 20 people don't keep paying income tax. If they don't get another job, if the jobs aren't there type of thing. And it's like, I'm surprised there's not a more like patriotic, I'm not like a classic national party type voter, but I'm surprised I'm not hearing from the nationalist types out there something that's a lot more like pro-Australia. I don't know if that makes any sense or not, but I'm surprised I'm not hearing it being like, Australian, Aussie businesses, Aussie stocks, Aussie ETFs, like let's build up the greatest country in the world, all that kind of rhetoric, because that seems like it would speak to people and it would get people excited about, paying less tax and stuff, but I'm not an economist either. Maybe we will see it.
I think that could work for like an election run, but I think everyone's just kind of at the moment reacting to what's being proposed currently rather than coming up with a whole platform as a reaction to, the changes. But I suppose another angle or another way you could work within the proposed rules I've seen is it kind of changes this trade-off between full financial independence and semi-retirement, where let's say you're following the sell down strategy, and whether it's a two-phase strategy with super or whether it's just building a portfolio to live off that outside super completely, doesn't really matter. It works the same way, but it changes the trade-off to the point where if you're going to lose the bottom two brackets, basically, because your capital gains will go straight into the 30% bracket, then it starts to become more efficient to have part-time income to absorb. Like if you're making 30, 40 grand a year, you're basically starting to approach the 30% bracket anyway. So that will absorb all that space that you have that goes unused if you're following the sell down strategy. So it could become more efficient to actually semi-retire earlier, but for a bit longer, and that becomes effective from a tax perspective, while also not having to do the journey for quite as long. Have you thought about that?
Dave, have they confirmed if they're going to treat that capital gain stuff separately at the moment? Like in terms of, if you earn, I guess it just depends how they order it, right? Because the ATO doesn't really know. Like if you earn 50K from capital gains or 50K from income, it's not like they say your first 50K is from capital gains and then you're in a higher tax bracket. That doesn't make sense because they can't know that. So they've kind of got to put it at the end in a way when they do the calculations, I guess. There's no other way to do it, I imagine. Like they'd have to put your income first so it fills up the bottom parts and then put capital gains with the rest. But so I kind of get your point in terms of let's say my strategy was to sell out 50K a year of stocks or ETFs. Under the old tax rules, you would be like, why would I get a job? I'm going to have to pay 30 cents on the dollar for everything I earn. So basically I have to work 30% more hours or whatever you want to call it. Whereas under the new proposed tax rules, it's not that you're better off. It's just that disincentive isn't there because you got to pay that money on before you weren't paying it on the capital gains. Now you are paying it on the capital gains. So when you actually go get a job, you're getting the full benefit of the job, right?
Yeah. And it could make sense to then, if you're going to be doing it that way, to retire sooner. Or to semi, because if you're going to be working part-time then, and you need 50K or 70K or whatever, then if you do it sooner, you can kind of fill in that gap and have the part-time work without needing quite as much and having it be relatively tax effective at the same time, because you're going to be paying the minimum on your investments anyway.
If I could play that back again. So if you were just doing 50K of capital gains, like a sell down, before the tax changes, you were better off than the new proposed tax changes. You definitely have like a clear more money beforehand. However, if you have 50K of income and 50K of capital gains sellouts every year, you are equal. Same situation before and after the tax changes. So the part-time, it's not so much that the part-time is better, it's more that like part-time financial independence is like the same post-budget by that definition. And no employment financial independence is clearly to some degree worse, assuming that, we're talking about the kind of capital gain sellout scenario.
Yes. So then that could mean that you might as well bring it forward if you were, because it kind of optimizes it, right?
Yes, sure. Right. So it's like, rather than, wait till I'm 50 and then never work again, maybe I'll just go part-time when I'm 40 and work part-time till I'm 60 type of thing, in terms of like assuming those numbers add up. But it's just like you end up kind of paying for it later anyway. So like, what's the point of like working full-time just to then hit that higher tax rate with the 30% floor?
Yeah. Exactly. There was also one other funny thing I thought about is, how they're trying to basically say that this, I think we talked about it in the last episode, but that basically like it hurts like the big end of town sort of thing, the wealthy people and the big investors, but it really doesn't, because usually they'll invest in like corporate structures anyway, so they're probably going to be paying 30% tax regardless, right? And if you've got $20 million and you do your best to have very poor cash producing investments and they net you 1%, that's still $200,000 a year. You're going to be paying the highest level of tax anyway, even if you're trying not to. So the funny thing about it is a lot of super wealthy people, they could just not pay the tax ever anyway, because they'll always be able to borrow against their assets, because they can access private banking and things like that. So they can refinance and access loans against their wealth, whether it's like real estate they own, whether it's a big stock portfolio, without needing to like prove serviceability and all this garbage, because they can do like asset-based lending without needing a job as such. So I mean, they're fine, right? They have the most flexibility of anyone. So maybe something to aspire to, Hayden.
This is something that I struggle with when it comes to this part of it, is the 30% floor just affects poor people. Like if I just look at the maximum tax you pay, I think it's around about $5,000, right, Dave? Like you end up paying like on up to that 50K, up to that 30% thing. It's something around that, like in the single digit thousands of dollars. And it's like, it's just people who have a ton of income they're just not going to care. Oh, you might make a bit of revenue off them. But if these people were living off massive capital pools and selling it off and, even if they were just doing it personally under their own name, it's like, oh, okay, now they're going to have to pay several $1,000s extra tax a year instead of tens of thousands. And this is why I find the 30% floor, even though it's not going to affect people that much, in the grand scheme of things, it's like I find it the most annoying because it does nearly feel ideological, because I just don't understand the whole, tax the rich mentality here. Like it just feels they're like, we're just not going to let people who are living off capital be as well off as people living off income. And that's been their talking points. And that one is starting to grate me the more and more I think about it.
It just doesn't make sense to not have normal tax brackets apply. So then it makes me think that they obviously, because we've seen the other movements, right, over the last couple of years, even with the like previous elections targeting franking credits and stuff, but we've had the unrealized capital gains tax attempt that didn't quite work. We've had the other super tax changes that have gone through. It just seems like there's going to be an ongoing targeting of investment assets and the wealthy in general to pay more, rather than, the government being more efficient and maybe doing some, actual reform and maybe broadening the tax base a bit. It just seems like that's the direction that we're heading. So how effective that'll be, not too sure, but it seems to be the focus, let's say.
Yeah, I could complain about that for a long time. I'm going to say it's on the podcast, so I actually hold myself to it, but because otherwise I won't do it. But I'm going to see Dave maybe this weekend if I want to build that part-time FI versus no employment FI, make it a little calculator or something, because that'd be really interesting to.
That would be great.
That'd be really interesting to see. And if people are confused about that, leave comments so Dave will be like, Hayden, people are waiting for it. But the example of that is like, would you rather, is there a scenario where you get to choose between going no employment when you're no employment for 2 years, or like part-time employment for 3 or something like that, or whatever the equivalent is, and the point is that before, whatever those two comparisons were, the part-time one will be more appealing. The no employment one will be the same appealing. And then you can kind of like look at that to be like, maybe this idea I have in my head of like, I'm just going to stop working one day is less logical than it used to be.
There was a conspiratorial theory that the idea is to stop people dropping out of the workforce and becoming self-funded retirees so that they stay in the workforce and that, they're more productive and all the rest of it. What do you think about that one, mate?
That'd be silly, because obviously if they have, income generating assets, it doesn't matter, right? If anything, they should, if they really wanted to solve that problem, they should just make a tax that says like, you have to work 40 hours a week and every hour you don't work will tax you some amount every year.
Oh God.
Like a labor,
that's like a slavery shit.
Yeah, like an anti-labor tax or something.
Jesus.
That's, if you have a problem, that's how you'd have to solve it. Like, there's no reason to say, someone out there on their vast income portfolio is like, shouldn't pay tax because we want, the economy to focus on productive assets. And also whenever the government's like, we want income producing assets, not just things that go up in price. I'm like, I don't even think they understand how the world works sometimes, some of them, because I feel like they're nearly like so weirdly fixated on housing. They're like, oh, that's how housing works. And it's like, well, yeah, housing price goes up typically just because it's a speculative market. But, when a business, and a lot of the economy's businesses, when a business goes and like, Atlassian's gone and built a new building near Central Station in Sydney, I don't know if they own it. I don't know anything about it, but like, I'm sure it's increased the value of their company because they've taken things they would have paid in dividends and used it to build more stuff. So now they have more things. So their business is worth more money. And it's like through doing that, they have created jobs in construction, that pays tax and employs people. But like the idea that like, we want to encourage Atlassian just to like pay a profit to shareholders. I'm not saying there's a worse, but like it's this whole idea of like, we want to encourage income producing assets. It's like, not everything is a house, everyone. That's my reaction to a lot of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I don't think it's been thought all of the way through. I'm not sure if they're thinking about it in terms of wanting to encourage income producing assets or just saying like, where's the money? Where can we get some extra tax revenue?
They have literally said in interviews, like we need to, we want to encourage more like productive assets than things that go up in price. That's like their talking points, which again, just feels silly. This whole thing, like you and I have chatted about this off the podcast, all this budget topic would just bloody disappear if all they did was address the housing problem. If all they did was say, we're going to change the indexation on housing, and you know what? That'd be such a fair, I'm sorry for being so, I feel like I'm so incoherent on this episode today. So I'm sorry for anyone who's made it this far. But like if all they did was we said, you know what? We are so sick of people getting rich off property, whereas people need to live there. And you know what else sucks? A lot of young people, they've been buying investment properties that go up 1% in value and lose the money. And they're screwed because they're going to have to pay tax on what little growth they get. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to revamp the tax system on housing. And we're going to make sure that the people who lose out on housing aren't hurt by it and the people who benefited are not encouraged to do it. And we're going to use that as one of the levers to help restore everything going on in housing. That's the capital gains discussion. I feel like we all wouldn't be talking about it. We all would have just like woken up last Tuesday and been like, that sounds good. Anyway, let's have a conversation about, which is your favorite stock this week. But instead, they've just gone and like applied it everywhere. And that's all we're really talking about. We're not complaining about capital gains tax. It's just like, wait. I thought this was about housing. Why are we talking about this other stuff now?
Well, they haven't fixed anything. That's part of the thing that you can't help but be extremely skeptical when the focus is housing, but they haven't actually fixed anything to do with housing, right? Like by definition, it wasn't the tax policy that created the gigantic run up in housing, because by removing it, they're expecting prices not to go down. They're just expecting prices to grow slightly less quickly. So that means it's not, if it was the whole thing like holding up the property market, as soon as you remove it, property market would collapse, but they're not expecting that at all. So then that can't be true at the same time. And then the other thing obviously is, what have they done to like improve on the supply side? They're actually expecting that the changes will result in like, 35 less houses being built because of the changes over the next whatever estimates, while expecting also that migration is going up at the same time. So you can't you have no credibility when you say we're doing it for this reason, but then like XYZ says like it contradicts what you've supposedly done it for. It doesn't make any sense.
If you just think about it logically, and I agree with Dave on this one, at best, the incentives are the same. And at worst, the incentives are worse to build new supply. At best, they haven't done anything to actually financially encourage new builds. And at worst, whilst they've left some exemptions for new builds, they've removed the number of people that can buy those new builds in a tax advantageous way, which, again, I'm not making a moral judgment on there, but it's just like, no one comes out of this budget who was going to build houses before and says anything like, I should do more of this now. They either come out being like, same thing, same before, same after, or they come out and be like, maybe I'll second guess this slightly because now people aren't going to want to buy houses. So I might as well not build them. Like they're the two bookends of the outcomes, which is, to your point, it's strange that they're like, we need to address the housing problem. But it's like if they came out, Dave, and they were like, all new houses built after May 12th, 2026 will forever be capital gains tax exempt for 30 years. I'd be like, I don't know if that sounds smart, but at least it's trying to do something. Like at least that actually like might cause more supply. But there's just nothing in the proposals that actually incentivize anyone to do more than they were now.
Yeah, and not to be too negative, because I've seen some people that are like getting a bit, I suppose, frustrated with the direction of the tax system in terms of like discouraging people from investing and stuff like that, making it less enticing, let's say, to invest for their future and all that. So some people are like, well, what's the point now? Like, why should I sacrifice and invest and do all of this stuff? Wouldn't it just be better to get on the pension instead? This seems like that's what they want me to do, right? If I'm investing and trying to build wealth, and I'm obviously seen as some sort of a parasite on society. So maybe I'll just get in line for the handouts, mate, and just enjoy my life now, just spend what I've got, and then you can manufacture the numbers so that you end up with a nice pension and a nice paid off home later, and happy days.
Can I tell you my grand plan to solve everything that I haven't thought out, and it's probably a bad idea?
Hayden, you can't cut the PPOR exemption on capital gains tax. You can't do it, mate. You can't do it. Because I don't think you'll live to see 2027.
I would leave this earth happily if that happened somehow. I reckon if you make people pay tax on all assets, including their primary home, and you introduce an inheritance tax so that you can't just continue to build up wealth intergenerationally in small pockets of people, I can't see why you could just let the rest of the tax system be a lot nicer, because you just be like, you can do what you want, build what you want, grow what you want, but we'll come for it. Like
enjoy it while you're here.
Yeah, like if you want to build a big business and get rich, like go at it, have a great time. Make your kids' lives better. But we're going to be there.
We're waiting.
No, I mean, it's
the Grim Reaper and the tax.
I'm not proposing this seriously, but I'm also not. I'm not making a spoof. I just think sometimes I'm like that is the problem. Like the problem at the end of the day is that rich people park their wealth in very expensive houses that never gets taxed, and then they just pass on wealth to their kids, and wealth just continues to build up. Like the gap between rich and poor families is different.
But it doesn't though, because most inheritance is like completely gone in like 3 generations. So I'm not sure that's actually true.
That's fair. Because it just gets like trickled down to some kids that can't manage it, and then they sell it, and then they go do drugs, and it disappears.
Yeah, because they don't know what it took to build it, so then they don't know how to manage it properly, and then they'll just spend it, and the next generation knows even less, so then they just blow it as well. I think that's what if you look it up, that's what the findings are. It doesn't last.
Okay, I'll drop the inheritance tax topic then. We'll go back to the PPOR. Have you seen that Have you seen that meme, Dave, that says like, I can't believe it's taken 30 generations and I'm going to have to be the one to create generational wealth for my family. It's like no one did it before me and now I have to do it. God damn it. If anyone here, like sincerely, if anyone listening to this and you have made it this far, does actually have what you think are kind of concise ways that you think a lot of these problems that everyone's trying to solve could be fixed, we actually do love to hear about it in the comments too, because it's such a great intellectual exercise. And I think everyone being engaged in these kinds of topics is just good for society generally.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, hopefully we don't do another episode on this for a long time, but yeah, happy to hear ideas too, because I think that's the thing is people are happy to hear a fully fleshed out idea like, okay, we're going to increase taxes here, and then with that money, we're going to do X, Y, Z. But I think some of the frustration was that didn't really happen here. It's like, we're going to increase taxes here and then problem solved. So I think maybe that's part of it. But if you're feeling a bit frustrated, guys, just remember that continue to invest, continuing to compound your money, continuing to focus on the big picture and all of the important things that we normally speak about here on the podcast is still just as powerful as before, right? You don't, as much as we kind of joked about it today, you don't want to end up reliant on the government in your later years. It is much better to be self-sufficient, even if you have to pay a bit more tax, even if people hate you for being lucky and privileged and all the rest of it. Investing is still the best path to the life that you want.
That's a good point, Dave. I've met self-funded retirees, and I don't think I met one of them that's like, I wish I was poorer and living off the government. But I've met a lot of people living off the government that are like, I wish I had more money. So that's probably some good life advice now that I reflect on it. Thank you for making it to the end of this fairly incoherent episode talking about the budget. It's been good fun. I hope other people are finding it useful to talk about. It's something that the more you talk about it, the better. It's one of those things where if someone says, oh, why are you worrying about it? Don't let them bully you. This budget as it's proposed will cause people probably, in many cases, to work more or less years of their life to achieve their same goals. That's a real thing for real people. So it's completely fine to care about it and to chat about it. But hopefully you found it interesting. As Dave said, this may be the last episode we talk about with the budget generally in a while. If we have future episodes, we'll be talking about much more specific strategies, or parts of the episodes will be on specific strategies. We don't have any intention at the moment to commentate on the budget generally, emotionally any further, because we've done that for essentially, 3 episodes, including an Instagram live. Go check that out as well. And if you do have any questions about the budget or any thoughts, you want to join us on the podcast, talk about your situation and how it's potentially changed, or just anything in general. It doesn't have to be to do with the budget. Reach out to us, Perla, on social media, Strong Money on social media, or you can email us, hello@aussiefipod.com, and we'll be there and reach back to you when you contact us. So thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys. Catch you in the next episode.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Aussie Fire. For more FI inspiration, head to perla.com to browse our resources, calculators, and community insights. Perla is an authorized representative, number 1281540 of Sandland Private Wealth, Pty Ltd, with AFSL number 337927. Knowledge is power, especially when investing. So always seek advice and/or check out the relevant disclosure document for any financial product, including the PDS and TMD before deciding. These are available from the product issuer's website. When you invest, your capital is at risk, and past performance is not a reliable indicator of future investment returns.